Last week, in the Sunday Mass, it was the Feast of the Transfiguration. And we saw how Jesus, with 3 disciples of his, went into the mount and transformed before them, and his dress was turned white in a very special way. This Sunday, we're going to move from the mount to the lake. We're going to move from being up high in the mountain, and we're taken to the Lake of Galilee, to the Sea of Galilee, where they're going to have a similar experience with Jesus. Last week, only 3 of the disciples. This week, it appears to be that the 12 disciples had an incredible experience with Jesus. So today, in this homily, I want to address 2 questions. The first question is, why did Jesus choose to walk over the sea? And the second question is, what lesson could we take to our own lives now that we see that Jesus walked over the sea? So let us address first the question, why does Jesus walk over the sea? And I think that the best way to understand the answer is we have to look at the book of Exodus. We will see 3 important similarities between the book of Exodus and this passage. In the book of Exodus, you will remember that God controlled the ocean in a way that only God can do. We all remember that moment when God separated the sea in 2 so that Moses could walk through the sea. And it is interesting because when you come to think about it, the water in the Bible means, on the one hand, life, because we know that nothing can live without water, but at the same time, water also means death, because the excess of water and the flood of water also meant death for the Hebrews. So back in the days, when God separated the ocean, that is a feat, that is something that only God could do. So when we look at the gospel, and when we see that Jesus has power over the sea, and can walk over the sea in the midst of the storm, something is calling back to the book of Exodus. Second, in the book of Exodus, when Moses sees the burning bush and asks the burning bush, who is it and what is the name? The burning bush answers Moses, I am who I am. Have you noticed that today Jesus has exactly the same expression as in the book of Exodus? Jesus spoke to them and said, take courage, it is I. So Jesus controls the ocean and refers to himself the same name as God presented to him, to Moses. Third, what is the reaction that the disciples have when they see Jesus? Fear. They feel overwhelmed by this apparition. Do you know what is the reaction that Moses had when he encountered God? Fear. So listen. Control over waters. The name of God, it is I. He produces fear. All of these 3 connections suggest that the passage that we are reading today is a typical passage that we would call a theophany, a place where God reveals himself. And it is interesting to see the connection between this gospel and last Sunday's gospel. 2 weeks in a row, we can see that God is revealing his mystery in Jesus. The question is, how is this relevant for our life? That is the second part of the homily. And the answer, we find it in the reaction of the disciples and the way the gospel ends today. Look how the gospel ends. those who were in the boat did him homage, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So we can be sure that in this passage, Jesus is revealing that he is God, because the disciples prostrate before him and adore him and worship him as if he was God himself, and Jesus doesn't deny this worship. So today I wanted to talk to you about reverence to God himself. And when you come to think about it, I think that Mass, every Sunday and every day, is not so different to the experience that the apostles had in the Sea of Galilee. When you come to think about it, in the same way as the disciples made homage to Jesus when he came into the boat, so we Catholics are called to give homage to Christ present in the Eucharist. That is why when we come into the church, what do? We genuflect. And as we genuflect, we're doing something very similar to what the apostles did in the boat. But I want to take it one step further. And I wanted to share my opinion with you about something. Maybe it can be a little bit controversial, but I'm only going to share my opinion. I think that in the same way as we're called to genuflect when we come into the church, I also have the opinion that the best way to receive communion is kneeling and in the mouth. Because personally, I think it is the way in which we express with our body the reverence and the worship that we are attributing to Jesus in the same way as the disciples did in the boat. With this, I am not saying that the other ways to receive communion are not reverent. I haven't said that, and I don't believe that. Because if you study the history of the church, during the first millennial of the church, the normal way to receive communion was in the hand. And I think that people receive communion in the hand with great reverence and with great devotion. But I only wanted to express my opinion, and I wanted to share with you that although both ways can be reverent, I personally think that it seems to be more in accordance with the gospel, more in accordance with this passage, that the right way to tribute worship and to receive Jesus is kneeling down and in the mouth, very similar to the way in which the apostles today knelt down when they understood that Jesus was not only a prophet, but was God himself. And I want to add one more thing. I also think that it is true that you could kneel and receive communion in the mouth, and sometimes our mind can be in the grocery list after we receive communion, right? So really receiving communion and kneeling down is no guarantee of anything. So today I also want to encourage you, let us remind ourselves that when we come to Mass, when we come close to the Eucharist, we are called to express our worship simultaneously with our body and with our mind and soul. So my invitation and my challenge for all of you today is, as we leave this Eucharist, as we kneel down for the Eucharistic prayer, I challenge you, not only kneel down with your body, also live reverently Mass with your soul and with your mind. As you receive communion, not only do it reverently in your hand or in your mouth or kneeling down or standing, but also try to make simultaneously reverence with your body and with your mind and soul. So brothers and sisters, let me synthesize what I want to share with you today. Number one, why does Jesus walk over the sea? Because he is showing he is God himself. As he has dominion over water, as he takes the name of God for himself, it is I, and as his presence brings fear over the disciples, like God brought fear over Moses. Second, how can we connect this with our life? Look at the attitude of the apostles in the boat. They offer homage to Jesus. That means in every Eucharist, we are called to live it reverently. As we genuflect, as we come into the Mass, as we kneel for the Eucharistic prayer, as we come to receive communion. And remember, brothers, it is not only about what we do with our bodies. The challenge is to do with our bodies, simultaneously with our mind and with our soul.